Every video about the tritone tells you the same story. Medieval church banned it, Black Sabbath used it, therefore, metal is rebellion. That story is wrong, and the real one is darker. The tritone wasn't banned. There was no enforcement, no monks being punished for playing the wrong interval. The ban was a compositional guideline, not a law. And the idea that the tritone is universally unsettling, hardwired into the human brain, that claim has been directly challenged by the most rigorous cross-cultural study ever conducted on dissonance. Which means the church didn't discover a universal truth about sound. They created a culture association, and then they called it divine law. That's the real story. And it's the same story the Inquisition tells, the same story the trial by combat tells. Men weaponizing their own preferences as God's will. The tritone, 6 semitones. Exactly halfway between a note and its octave. In Western music theory, intervals are evaluated by how they resolve. A perfect fifth creates tension that resolves naturally. A major third moves towards stability. The ear follows these intervals the way a sentence follows grammar. There is a logic to the movement, an expectation of where the sound is going. The tritone violates that expectation. It sits at the mathematical midpoint of the octave, equidistant from both the root and its resolution. It pulls in 2 different directions simultaneously. It creates tension with no natural resolution point. Medieval theorists working within Gregorian planchant developed compositional rules to maintain the sense of order sacred music required. The tritone appeared in their theoretical texts with a specific designation, diabolus in musica, the devil in music. Not because they believed sound was literally demonic, because this interval did something to the listener that other intervals didn't, and they needed a name for it. So here's what the popular version gets wrong. The idea of an active church-wide ban with enforcement, monks being disciplined for playing the wrong interval, is not well supported in the primary historical record. Musicologists who have examined the sources describe the prohibition as compositional convention embedded in music theory, not a formally enforced ecclesiastical law. The distinction matters because the accurate version is more interesting. Medieval theorists weren't reacting to theology. They were reacting to acoustics. Sacred music in the medieval tradition was not entertainment. It was a technology for producing a specific psychological state, order, resolution, elevation, the felt sense of harmony between the human and the divine. The tritone disrupted that state, not metaphorically, measurably, and the theorists who built frameworks around avoiding it understood this intuitively, 800 years before neuroscience existed. But here's what they also did, and what nobody talks about. They didn't just avoid the tritone. They declared that the aversion to it was part of the natural order. They took a subjective response to a specific acoustic phenomenon, and they encoded it as divine law. The sound wasn't just uncomfortable. It was against God. If you're not subscribed, you are missing the rest of this series. Subscribe now. The neuroscience of consonance and dissonance has been studied extensively, and the findings illuminate exactly what medieval theorists were responding to. The human auditory system processes intervals by evaluating the ratio relationships between frequencies. Simple ratios like 2:1 for an octave, 3:2 for a perfect fifth, produce waveforms that align regularly. The auditory cortex processes these as stable and resolved. The tritone ratio, approximately 45:32 in just intonation, produces a complex, irregular waveform with no clean alignment point. The auditory cortex generates what researchers describe as a sustained prediction error, the neural signal that fires when expected patterns don't resolve. The brain is waiting for the interval to go somewhere. It keeps waiting. And so far, this confirms the medieval observation. The tritone does produce tension in the auditory system. The theorists identified something real. But here's where the story falls apart, and where every other video about the tritone gets it wrong. The claim that the tritone's unsettling quality is universal. hardwired into every human auditory processing, comes from studies showing consistent dissonance responses across Western and some non-Western populations. In 2016, a research team at MIT, led by Josh McDermott, published a study in Nature that tested this claim with a population no one had tested before: the Tsimane, a native Amazonian people with minimal exposure to Western music. The Tsimane can distinguish consonants from dissonance. Their ears work fine, but they show no preference for one over the other. Let me say that again for the kids in the back. The people with no exposure to Western music theory, no cultural framework for this sound is pleasant, this sound is wrong, did not find the tritone unsettling. They were indifferent. A 2025 follow-up found that Tsimane with more contact with global cultural began showing consonants preferences, suggesting the response is learned, not innate, cultural, not hardwired. The medieval theorists didn't discover a universal truth about sound. They discovered a truth about their own culture and called it God's. Tony Iommi, 1967, 17 years old, last day of work at a sheet metal factory in Birmingham, England. A machine sheared off the tips of his middle and ring fingers on his right hand, his fretted hand. He considered quitting. He'd been playing guitar since he was a teenager. The injury made standard fingering impossible. The pain was severe enough that pressing strings against the fretboard was agony. Then a manager at the factory told him about Django Reinhardt, a Romani jazz guitarist who'd lost the use of 2 fingers in a caravan fire and invented an entirely new playing style to compensate. Reinhardt didn't adapt to his injury. He created something that wouldn't have existed without it. Iommi heard the story and made the same decision. He melted down liquid soap bottles to fashion prosthetic fingertips, plastic caps that fit over the severed ends. They were crude, they were painful, they worked just enough. But the prosthetics couldn't press standard tension strings cleanly. So Iommi detuned. He lowered the pitch of his guitar, slackening the strings so his damaged fingers could form chords without crushing his own nerve endings. The detuning darkened the sound, lower frequencies, heavier overtones, a tone that standard tuning couldn't produce, because standard tuning was designed for undamaged hands. Then he wrote the riff, 3 descending notes followed by a tritone interval, sitting at the center of what became the opening of Black Sabbath's self-titled debut. Everyone says the tritone invented heavy metal. That's a half-truth. The tritone was one note choice. The detuning was the architecture, the low, heavy tone landscape that defines the entire genre. That came from a factory accident, from severed fingers, from plastic soap bottles melted into prosthetics on a hand that should have never played again. He built new fingers from industrial waste, then used those fingers to write the sound the church said belonged to the devil. The machine that destroyed his hands gave him the sound that destroyed the church's rules about sound. The through line from medieval plainchant to Black Sabbath isn't a story about rebellion. It's a story about what happens when men declare their own preferences to be divine law. The medieval theorists experienced the tritone as unsettling. That was a real subjective experience. But instead of saying, this sound doesn't serve the function we need it to serve in worship, they said, this sound is against God. They took a cultural response and made it a cosmic verdict. And that pattern repeats. Every time men in authority encounter something that doesn't serve their framework, they don't just reject it. They declare that God rejects it. The Inquisition did it with doctrine. Trial by combat did it with violence. The music theorists did it with sound. The McDermott study doesn't prove the tritone is harmless. It proves something more uncomfortable. That the thing the church called the devil in the music might only sound demonic to people who were raised inside a culture that taught them to hear it that way. Scripture says God created all sound, all frequency, all vibration. The tritone is a mathematical relationship between 2 pitches, If God created mathematics, then the tritone is part of the architecture of creation. The medieval theorists didn't avoid it because God told them to. They avoided it because it disrupted the experience they wanted worship to produce. Then, they called that preference divine. Every metal guitarist who ever played a tritone and felt something shift in the room, that feeling is real. But it might not be the sound of the devil. It might be the sound of a culture confronting the thing it was taught to fear and refusing to look away. God didn't ban the tritone. Men did, and they put His name on the band to make it stick. Subscribe for more creepy science, dark history, and bizarre facts. Learn hard. Live loud. I'll see you in the next one.